Yeah, good.
Ya empezamos, señores y señoras. Hi, I'm Wendy Lewers. I'm co-founder of Beyond Conflict and chair of the advisory committee of Beyond Conflict, and it is my great honor and my great delight to introduce Tom Pickering, who has literally flown in for a few hours to be able to talk with all of you, with a man with vast experience. You have his bio, and he has been ambassador to Israel, the Russian Federation, India, El Salvador, Nigeria, Jordan, and the United Nations in New York, and then served as Undersecretary of State, which is the highest position, except for the Secretary of State, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was a special assistant to the Secretary, William Rogers, and to Henry Kissinger when he was executive secretary for Henry Kissinger, and my husband was the deputy executive secretary for Henry Kissinger. But what I'd like to add to this is that he is co-chair of the International Crisis Group, which is one of the leading organizations that deals.
Just resigned.
Just resigned. Well, he's just the former co-chair of the crisis group. One of the great things that has also happened is that there's something called Pickering Fellows in the State Department, and Pickering Fellows are the best and the brightest who come into the State Department and pass the Foreign Service exam. And they are superb. And Adam Levy, who worked with us, was a Pickering Fellow and was over the top thrilled about being that. So it's a great tribute to Tom's illustrious career. He's also, with my husband and Frank Wisner and Stephen Heinz, a number of other people, working on something called the Iran Project that has just published its fourth report about Iran. And for his sins, he's been the head of the panel on Benghazi with Admiral Mullen. So without further ado, Tom has to leave precisely at 3 because he has to get on a plane and go back to Washington, D.C. He's going to speak, and then he's going to take questions and answers. Or questions, and he'll do the answering, we hope.
I'll take
A Q&A, as they call it. All right.
Good.
Tom?
Thanks, Wendy, very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and honestly, a great opportunity to get down here and see a little of the summer humidity that we missed in Washington so badly. I want to do 3 things. I once spent a little time studying speaking. I don't think it caught on, but one of the things that I learned is that all good Methodist sermons, you know the Methodists were great sermonizers, have 3 points. So my 3 points today are to talk a little bit about diplomacy and what it tells us about these things here, at least in terms of the better practitioners of the art. Some stories as to how I've seen that work out from time to time, and then perhaps a few conclusions that I can leave with you, particularly about, if not dialogue, negotiations, but I think dialogue and negotiations come close enough together that while we could split hairs in trying to define the difference, it pretty much elides enough to be part of the same affair. Diplomacy has had its ups and downs in this country, and I think recently has been under a cloud for no good reason other than, in fact, it doesn't work very fast. It's not very certain. That since the 1920s, the practitioners of diplomacy have appeared in Hollywood movies as effete Eastern university graduates who go to cocktail parties and really do nothing to earn their living. And all of this has given diplomacy a very bad name. I think it's coming back. It's coming back in large measure because we had an interesting experiment where we tried war to substitute for diplomacy. And everybody thought that was going to produce the magic answer very quickly, but war and military force does not seem to be a very good way to solve diplomatic problems either. So we're now turning back. So I think I would only give you one story about this. Take your mind back to the middle of the Cold War. Let's go back to the 50s, when kids were hiding under the desks, and when we had bomb alarms, and people thought, in fact, that nuclear weapons were right around the corner. We kind of dressed up nuclear weapons. They were just like bombs, only a little larger, so that, in fact, we didn't frighten anybody. But what we lacked in that day and age with the Soviet Union was a sense that each of us, many times over, could destroy the other, and perhaps the world with it. And this was so cataclysmic that it began to build up the kind of pressure that put us together. And over a period of 10 or 15 years, it was not the generals so much as the diplomats who spent time together figuring out how we could do things to make this confrontation, this nuclear confrontation, more stable. We reduced the number of weapons on each side, then we reduced the number of delivery vehicles. And then we negotiated a hotline between the two of us so we wouldn't have to wait for the telephone operator to connect us. And we could send messages back and forth very rapidly, each in our own language. And then we began to talk about things like inspections and making sure that each side was following the rules. And all of this was put into place over a period of time, and interestingly enough, there was very little in the way of partisan difference in the United States or in the Soviet Union. Not that there were partisan differences in the Soviet Union, but there were individual differences. And there was some obvious opposition to it, but in general it worked. And it was quite a triumph, because if it hadn't worked, the chances were much larger that we might not be here now. And of course, Cuba, a country that we all look at as being very important to us, was the locale perhaps for the greatest stimulus for us to begin to do these kinds of things in diplomacy. And that was not minimal in any way at all, but it taught us lessons about how to behave, how to signal to each other, how to find ways to configure our forces in a more stable fashion, but even more importantly, how to use negotiations. And I agree, they're never a strategy, but they're hellishly important diplomatic tools to make things work. And so I'll focus a little bit on some of those things. We can say a lot about diplomacy, and we can say a lot about negotiations, and they are, in the governmental sphere, extensions of the kinds of things that we're speaking about here. And in many ways, they can bring us some serious and important and very useful lessons. Starting a process of communication between countries that are not communicating is very significant. And Wendy was kind enough to mention the Iran project, and her husband Bill, who was an old friend and colleague, has really been the starter and the Energizer bunny in keeping this going. And it began back in 2001 and 2002, and it began under the well-founded proposition that we had no contact to speak of with Iran, that the absence of contact was not bringing things together, but rather pushing them apart, and that perhaps we could start with unofficial contacts and begin to move things ahead, and we did that. Bill interested the Iranians because the Iranians operated on these kinds of things at the official level, so you couldn't have unofficial talks with Iranians without having official approval. But it worked, and they were interested. And a lot of it worked through the man who represented them in New York, who is now their foreign minister, who happens to be a graduate of the University of Denver. In fact, I was with Madeleine Albright 2 nights ago, and it was her father's school at the University of Denver from which Jawad Zarif graduated. And we began these conversations We had them quietly, we had them often under third country or other organization auspices because that was the way the Iranians wanted to do it. Iran has domestic politics, and there were people in the Iranian domestic political arena who didn't really think the United States was their cup of tea. And we got into those situations where we often get into ourselves, where merely talking to the other side is seen as something that you really shouldn't do on the one hand. It kind of betrays your manhood and your principles. And it is what I would call the reverse application of dignity. And in many ways, you have to find ways to tear that down. And you can't be, in my view, a successful diplomat and believe that constant separation and fighting across the backyard is the way in which you're going to make progress. And I think it's important. You have to talk to people from whom you're estranged if you're going to close that gap. So that's what we did. And we hammered away at it. And one of the things we did with the Iranians is we created a document which was like the Shanghai communique that Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon created with the Chinese. It recognized the areas where we had differences as well as the places where we had common interests. And that was translated into Farsi and widely circulated among the Iranian leadership, and it made some progress. And as things grew on, we began to look at the growing concern that we all had about Iranian nuclear interests and what to do about that. And it became apparent to us 6 or 7 years ago in our talks and in our conversations that there were some serious roadblocks in the way. And that one of the serious roadblocks was that we wanted no Iranian nuclear program, and they wanted an Iranian nuclear program. And we didn't think we could get to no Iranian nuclear program. So we suggested if the problem was Iran's making a nuclear weapon, maybe we should start to think about how they could have a nuclear program without having either the impetus, the interest, or the possibility of getting a nuclear weapon. And that's really where we've come out. And we, among others, I think have had a significant influence on US government thinking, in part because we brought the simple aphorism to the table after all of our experience. Used to be George Shultz's aphorism, when you're in a deep hole, stop digging. And it means essentially, if you aren't getting anywhere, why don't you go back and figure out what it is that keeps you from getting anywhere? And then how can you begin to find a way to make the necessary changes you have to live with to make that happen? And I have a number of interesting experiences in that regard. Very early in my Foreign Service career, I had a very interesting opportunity to go work on our early efforts to stop nuclear testing. And after a year, when we finally got the Soviets interested in going on this, it became clear that neither of us was quite ready to stop testing entirely. But some very smart people, including a boss I worked for, said, okay, let's see if we can stop testing in the places that have affected the environment and human welfare and slow things down. And so we made a proposal to the Russians that you could either accept a whole treaty covering everything, or we would write a treaty covering everything but underground testing. And while it wasn't a perfect answer, it made a contribution. And in some respects, another diplomatic aphorism, which I think you also want to keep in mind as you work toward reconciliation and you look at questions of respect and dignity, is that sometimes, maybe more often than not, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And that if you're building in a direction in which you want to go, maybe the good is the better first step than the perfect. Not everybody feels that way, particularly in the domestic environment, but it's important. And so I think to some extent that now applies to the US-Iran question as well as it does to others. As we went ahead with Iran, it was fascinating because I can recall several occasions when we sat and talked with the now Iranian foreign minister when he represented them in New York. And one of the things he said, which was so obvious that it hit us all in the face, he said, you know, when you're ready to make progress with us, we aren't. And when we are, you aren't. And so the struggle is to get this going, we have to find a way when we're both ready together. And it was very interesting because for a long time we have wanted to negotiate, and they weren't getting very far, and they had an election 2 years ago. And their leader, who is not a dummy, let someone run who was both familiar with the nuclear questions, but also very much pledged in his own outlook and in his campaign to opening the international door once again for Iran. And of course, Iran was suffering under sanctions, aggravated in part by their own failure to run their own economy very well. And the election chose this man, and he's now Mr. Rouhani, the political leader of the government of Iran, and he's put a lot on the table in trying to bring these negotiations to conclusion. And I think that's interesting. One of the things that I think is important in beginning, and we struggled for years how to begin with the Iranians, and used almost everything we could think of. We got the president to write letters. Americans, senior Americans, gave speeches. The reaction was often, we're not ready. So we weren't getting anywhere. As it became clear we were getting close to getting ready, it became clear to us, and we encouraged our friends in government, and I think it was also clear to them, that they needed a help. And in the Middle East, there is a very long tradition called the wasta, or a process. And this is the intermediary. This is the trusted friend of both sides. This is the person who can say, without feeling a sense of retribution, who can say, in keeping with the dignity and the sense of mutual respect on both sides, it's now time for you to think about moving ahead, and I'm here to help you do that, and I can be in touch with the other side. You don't have to do that. You don't have to lower yourself in the eyes of the domestic audience you deal with, but you can work through me in a useful way. And it was very clear that the Sultanate of Oman, at the end of the Arabian Peninsula, had had a long and interesting historical relationship with Iran. In fact, I paid an early visit there in the early 1970s, and they were celebrating a military victory from an invasion from Yemen with the help of Iranian military support from the Shah. But when the Shah went, the Iranians kept their doors open. And the Iranians had been helpful over the years in securing the release of Americans and others who were put in jail in Iran for one reason or another. And it was the Sultan of Oman and a very good letter by the President of the United States that opened the door to very private conversations that began roughly in March of 2013, where for the first time in many years, the US and the Iranians had a sustained dialogue, and for the first time we had a sustained dialogue on the big but very tricky nuclear question. And 12 or so meetings in that dialogue helped to lead to a broader and more general agreement in November of 2013. And that really made a difference. It was important. So beginning is sometimes hard, but beginning is absolutely essential. And friends and others can often help with beginning. But beginning also has to begin against the backdrop of two things. The other side is sort of beginning to be ready itself. And you are in a position to encourage the other side, sometimes by doing things unilaterally on your own. Not as a quid pro quo. Not if you do this, I'll do that. Sometimes a gesture. We had ping pong in China. That was a Chinese gesture, essentially to say, we're ready. We'd like to do this. But it was a gesture that fit in China, not very well in the US. We had wrestling teams in and out of Iran long before it opened up. So sports isn't necessarily exactly the right way to proceed, but it can help. But in some ways, those are exercises in showing mutual respect. We'll meet you on an equal basis. You're welcome in our country. Not all of you, but some of you are welcome in our country. And that shows the door is then beginning to open, and people have looked for those kinds of gestures and can make them happen. In the 1980s, much to my surprise, I was asked to go to El Salvador as ambassador. And during that time, José Napoleon Duarte was elected president of El Salvador. And we had a very good relationship, and I saw him very frequently. And one evening he called me and said, "Can you come around?" And I said, "Yes." And we talked a bit, and he said, "In 2 days, I'm opening up a meeting with the guerrillas in northern El Salvador as a way to begin a process of finding an answer." And I said, "First, you have my personal congratulations. Secondly, I'll do everything that I can to be sure that the United States doesn't stand in the way." It was very important. It was not an easy issue because the United States had been polarized about Central America for some time. But in fact, within 18 hours, I got a message back and called him and said, "As far as the United States is concerned, you have our blessings. Do it." I have to say that I'm a little disappointed because in his biography, he failed to mention this, but that was okay. That's also diplomacy. But it was an interesting example of how things could move and get going and what you could do. I think that in many ways, over periods of time, you learn a lot about these things, but it is fundamental, I think, in moving in these directions, to practice and do some things that can be very helpful. I said just before we went into lunch to Mr. Soroy that I thought listening was a very important aspect. One, it conveys a note of respect. Two, it reinforces the issue of dignity. Three, it begins in its own way to invest in the process. Four, it means that you are not there to win a point, to make some kind of gain at the other person's respect. But even more significant, I think, is that so many of our problems come from a failure, first, to understand what is being said by the other side, being said by the people with whom you have a problem, being said by the folks that you need to work with to get some process moving ahead. And so I think it's very important to listen And of course, I'm not practicing that here today. I'm excused from that. But I hope to do that in a minute or two. But I always used to say, as a diplomat, I got paid exactly the same for listening as I did for talking. And I always thought that the ratio was 2/3 listening and 1/3 talking. Most diplomats find that very hard, including me, but that's nevertheless something you always want to keep in mind. But I think there is something else with respect to listening. Most people, when they begin to talk to you, will talk to you about the things that they have come to believe and understand about the current process in a way that they normally convey them. Nobody ever lost his own argument when they made it. And in fact, they always used to say that no American ambassador ever lost in his own cables back to Washington. So beyond merely hearing what was said, which in itself is very important, is further trying to understand what is really on the mind of the person opposite you, what motivates them, and where they really want to go. Because one of the essences of reconciliation, and indeed I think conciliation, but more reconciliation, is if you can figure out as you go ahead some of the major motivations and interests that the other side has, you've crossed the first hard bridge, because the next one is to start thinking about your own position in the same terms. And then the next bridge is, how can you put them together to make it work? And there the challenges are very interesting. And there a number of things can come to your rescue. Many of the problems that I've dealt with over the years have been helped by some knowledge of the technology that's engaged in the process. Others by the willingness to do things that represent challenging the first assumptions that you hold dear about the problem. A number of years ago, it became clear to us from the evidence at hand that Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, in part in retaliation from the 1987 bombing attack on his country by the United States, had bombed the Pan American aircraft over Scotland and brought it down with a huge loss of life. And we had enough serious information to be able to pinpoint where we believed the bomb had come from and when it had been put on the airplane and who had been involved. And 2 Libyan intelligence officers were identified as having carried out the operation. And interestingly enough, Gaddafi then was growing nervous about his isolation and indeed about his vulnerability and the fact that he wasn't making any progress. And he raised the question of, quote, giving these intelligence officers a fair trial. For him, a fair trial was in Libya, and we didn't trust Libyan justice. But we identified Scotland as the locus of the crime and therefore where it should be tried. And Gaddafi had said that he would move to have a fair trial in a neutral country. And so while it wasn't easy, a number of folks that I worked with in the State Department and I sat down one day and said, can we find the neutral country? And everybody said, well, the Dutch might work because that's where the International Criminal Court is and where the International Court of Justice is. And can we get a Scottish court moved to Holland? And so we did. Took a while. Had to go to the British Parliament, had to convince the Scots, we had to convince the Dutch, and there was a trial. And one of the gentlemen was convicted. I'm sorry that one of the gentlemen was not convicted. Eventually, the convicted gentleman was let go. But that was only part of the answer to the problem. It opened the door to a set of conversations which, in the long run, saw Mr. Gaddafi turn over his chemical weapons program, his nuclear program, such as it was to us, to dismantle and do with what we wished. So it was a very important start in moving the question ahead. I'll just say a few things to wind this up, because I can tell stories forever. I think it's important to recognize that, as I said at the beginning, you don't make progress until you talk to the people who can help you make progress from the other side. In diplomacy, they're usually classified as your enemy, whether you're at war with them or not. Of course, the first thing you want to do is drop that term. That is neither respectful nor indeed in any way appreciating the dignity of the other side. I think secondly, you want to understand that beginning to have a conversation in one fashion or another is a very important way to start the process. And I can tell you that there are any number of discussions and negotiations in which, over a period of time, the negotiators in both sides have become problem solvers, have become invested in finding the answer to the problem, have become persuasive enough with each other and with their governments to make that happen. And so, while you may say dialogue and discussion is just a process, beginning to shape it around things that you wish to resolve puts a new point on the issue and indeed the investment you make in it. I've been involved in participating and working on peace between Israel and its neighbors for well over 30 years. We made progress, and we have made progress. I have to tell you, however, now that I have a saying to myself that the only thing harder than making peace in the Middle East is to find a way finally and forever, never to have it come back, to kill off the process of finding peace in the Middle East. It's an optimistic statement. I've always considered myself an optimistic diplomat, and indeed, there are only two kinds of American diplomats in the Middle East, lunatics and optimists, so it's important. I think it's very important, however, that you also believe, if you're in government or in private life or in business, you don't get to choose who you negotiate with, either the person or persons, or indeed the group or groups that you're dealing with. They're part of what comes. It's just like you don't get a chance to choose your enemies very often. Rarely do you get a chance to choose your neighbors. And so now you have another very important factor you have to take into account. And I think it's significant to keep that in mind as you go down this road. My own feeling is that in any kind of discussion you undertake, as you begin to move ahead, your ability to give it some human quality can begin to build the rapport, can provide some of the respect and some of the appreciation of mutual interest in not running down the dignity of each side. Negotiators who believe that they get farther by spending all of their time on pressure tactics and running down the other side, I believe, make a colossal error. They prolong the process, they increase enmity. They make themselves, indeed, a deep part of the problem rather than the solution. And they fail to recognize how important it is that you understand that you and the people on the other side are going to have to make very significant, very hard decisions and take great risks. And if you have no trust in the people on the other side, that they are able both to face up to that decision and then find a way in their own society to deliver on it, then you have really not gotten over the first bridge. You're still stuck. And that's very significant and very important. To complicate this a little bit, but not too much, in the context in which we're speaking, no discussion with a, quote, other party, whether it is in business, even in personal life, and certainly in government, goes on without at least a two-sided negotiation. I always used to believe that my hardest job doing any negotiation for the US government was in Washington. And I don't say that just because a lot of us don't think a lot of Washington. I think a lot of Washington. But Washington was a place where they wanted to be sure that whatever I came up with as a negotiator, they could sell in Washington to the Congress. And there were a lot of people who were paid large amounts of money to be the junkyard dogs in front of their own agencies and departments. And that made things difficult, and it made it hard to bring things together. And so you had to develop, again, a two-sided relationship, not a two-faced relationship, but a two-sided relationship to bring things along. And that was useful and very significant. And many of the occasions in which I've worked, I've been helped by people in Washington who have undertaken to be the sponsors of negotiation and have had the capacity to work with me to move things along. I think finally, some of the most valuable experiences I've had have been those rare occasions when the negotiator on the other side and you had developed such a clear relationship that you could sit down together very privately, the kind of walk in the woods part of negotiation, and say, you know, we're not getting anywhere for the following reasons. And this is what I can do. What can you do? And hear back what they can do. You never expect 200%, but you expect something pretty close to where you might come out. And that's extremely important. And then you each have to say, okay, we know the general outline. If you could do a little more here, I can do a little more here. And begin to set the stage and move the question ahead. And that was, interestingly enough, I think, what happened in the dozen bilateral meetings with Iran. That kind of dynamic began to work and was very significant in setting the stage. And indeed, the Iranian negotiations had their own particular problem because it wasn't just the US and Iran. There were 5 other countries, 4 other permanent members of the Security Council in Germany. And to some extent, things got along so well that the US and Iran had then become, in effect, the authors of the solution. And the other folks were out in the cold. And particularly France bridled at being left behind. I suppose one can say, I hope there are no French citizens here now. I love France. But France is perhaps the most left out. And the most left out is always the one, if you have 2-year-olds, that cries the hardest. So that's part of the problem. And obviously, it was very interesting that that part worked. Let me, if I can, leave it there. And perhaps now open up to your questions, perhaps for all of us, but I hope I've been useful in putting into context my experience, which is mostly how this works between governments, that adds different dimensions, but many of the same challenges and many of the same opportunities exist. Whether it is, in fact, bringing together Americans around a particular subject in a town meeting, or finding a way to solve a major international problem. All of the things that we have been talking about here, in one way or another, play an important role. So thank you for your time and attention, and thank you for the privilege of being with you.